August 6, 1945 began like any other sweltering summer morning in the Pacific Theater, yet what unfolded would alter the course of human history in ways no military strategist had ever imagined. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto stood on the deck of the destroyer Yukikaze, watching the horizon where American ships had been spotted the previous evening. He had fought in every major naval engagement from Pearl Harbor to Leyte Gulf, witnessed the fury of American industrial might, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him or his comrades for what they were about to witness in the coming weeks. The Americans possessed a weapon so devastating, so incomprehensible in its mathematics of destruction, that Japanese officers would spend their final days trying to understand how thousands upon thousands of projectiles could rain down in what seemed like a single heartbeat. This was not hyperbole or war propaganda. This was the terrifying reality of American fire control technology and the proximity fuse, a combination that transformed naval warfare into something approaching apocalypse. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet, had received disturbing reports from surviving pilots who had attempted to attack American carrier groups near Okinawa. They spoke in hushed, trembling voices of walls of fire, of the sky itself erupting into a lattice of explosions so dense that aircraft simply disintegrated before reaching their targets. Some pilots, their minds struggling to process what they had seen, claimed the Americans had developed a way to make the air itself explode. Others theorized about radio-controlled shells that could think, that could hunt. The truth, as documented in declassified U.S. naval intelligence reports from 1946, was simultaneously simpler and more sophisticated than Japanese military intelligence could have guessed. The Americans had indeed revolutionized anti-aircraft warfare, but through engineering rather than magic. The VT fuse, variable time fuse, though VT was deliberately chosen to mislead enemy intelligence into thinking it meant variable trajectory, contained a miniaturized radio transmitter and receiver small enough to fit inside an artillery shell. According to historical records maintained by the Naval History and Heritage Command, this device sent out radio waves that bounced off approaching targets, and when the reflected signal reached sufficient strength, indicating dangerous proximity, the shell detonated automatically. Captain Tamichi Hara, one of Japan's most decorated destroyer commanders who would survive the war to write his memoirs, later described his first encounter with this technology during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. His destroyer had been providing anti-aircraft support when American fighters appeared overhead, pursued by Japanese aircraft. Within seconds, the American fleet opened fire. Hara watched in disbelief as the shells seemed to explode with uncanny precision around the Japanese planes. Not direct hits, that would have been understandable, even expected from skilled gunners, but explosions that occurred mere meters from their targets, close enough that shrapnel shredded wings and fuselages with surgical efficiency. What made this technology so devastating was not merely its existence, but its scale of deployment. American industrial capacity meant that by mid-1944, proximity-fused ammunition was being produced in staggering quantities. The Japanese Naval General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo received increasingly frantic reports throughout the summer of 1944, each one describing American anti-aircraft fire that defied conventional military understanding. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, found himself poring over pilot testimonies that read like science fiction. One report from a kamikaze pilot who had miraculously survived described attempting to dive on an American battleship near Saipan, only to encounter what he called a curtain of fire that anticipated my every movement. The reality, as later revealed in post-war technical analyses published by the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, was that American warships had transformed themselves into floating fortresses of computational firepower. The Mark 37 gun director, combined with analog fire control computers weighing several tons, could calculate trajectories accounting for ship motion, wind, temperature, and target movement, all within seconds. When these systems were paired with proximity-fused shells, the result was a defensive capability that increased anti-aircraft effectiveness by a factor of 5 compared to traditional time-fused ammunition. Rear Admiral Keizo Kimura, chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy's technical department, received a classified report in September 1944 that attempted to explain the American capability based on captured equipment fragments and interrogation of prisoners. The report, preserved in the National Archives collection of Japanese military documents, concluded that the Americans had somehow miniaturized radio equipment to an impossible degree. Japanese engineers, working with vacuum tubes that were fragile and relatively large, could not conceive of how a radio transmitter could survive the 15,000 times gravity acceleration of being fired from a 5-inch naval gun. The secret lay in American manufacturing precision and a revolutionary approach to ruggedized electronics. According to historical accounts from Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory, which developed the proximity fuse, engineers had created specially designed vacuum tubes with elements so tightly constructed that they could withstand tremendous shock. The battery that powered the fuse was activated by the acceleration of firing itself, a brilliantly simple solution that ensured the device only became active once airborne. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary fighter ace with 64 confirmed kills, experienced this technology firsthand during a mission near Iwo Jima in February 1945. Flying his Mitsubishi Zero, Sakai led a formation of 12 aircraft toward an American destroyer group. The ships opened fire when the Japanese planes were still 5 miles distant, an unusually long range that made Sakai cautious, but not overly concerned. Traditional anti-aircraft fire at such ranges was largely harassing fire, meant to break up formations rather than score direct hits. Then the sky erupted. Sakai would later describe it in his autobiography as flying into a wall of light and thunder. Shells were exploding not behind or ahead of the formation, but precisely at their altitude, creating overlapping fields of shrapnel. Within 30 seconds, 8 of his 12 aircraft had been destroyed. Sakai himself took shrapnel in his shoulder and arm, but managed to escape by diving to wave-top level. Of the 4 survivors, only 2 aircraft were still flyable. Not a single plane had gotten within 3 miles of the American ships. The development of the proximity fuse had begun in the summer of 1940, when Britain, desperate for any technological advantage against the Luftwaffe, had shared its most sensitive military secrets with the United States. According to records from the Tizard mission, named after British scientist Sir Henry Tizard, a delegation arrived in Washington carrying a black metal deed box containing cavity magnetron designs, early radar prototypes, and preliminary research on radio proximity detonators. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, recognizing the strategic implications, immediately authorized funding for what would become one of the war's most important secret weapons programs. Section T at the National Defense Research Committee, led by Merle Tuve at the Carnegie Institution, began intensive development in early 1941. The challenges seemed insurmountable. The device needed to be small enough to fit in a shell, robust enough to survive being fired, reliable enough to function in combat conditions, and cheap enough to mass produce. It also had to work without any external signal. Ships could not send radio commands to hundreds of shells simultaneously, meaning each fuse needed to be completely self-contained. By August 1942, after thousands of test firings and countless failures, the first successful proximity-fused shells were produced. The U.S. Navy, recognizing this could be the decisive weapon against Japanese air attacks, immediately classified the technology at the highest levels. Security protocols were extreme. Shells could only be used over water where duds could not be recovered by the enemy, and even allied nations were not fully informed about the technology's existence. Captain Kiyoshi Oba, a staff officer at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Truk, received intelligence reports in early 1943 about unusual American shell fragments recovered from the water near Guadalcanal. Japanese technical intelligence had retrieved pieces of shells that contained strange electronic components. The fragments were shipped to Tokyo for analysis, but Japanese engineers, according to post-war interviews conducted by U.S. technical intelligence teams, concluded the components were too fragile to be part of an active weapon system. They theorized these were parts of experimental radio equipment destroyed in battle. This catastrophic intelligence failure stemmed from the Japanese military's own technological limitations. Japan's electronics industry, while advanced in certain areas, had not achieved the manufacturing precision necessary for miniaturized, ruggedized components. Japanese proximity fuse research, which had begun independently in 1942, repeatedly failed because their vacuum tubes could not survive the shock of firing. By 1944, the program had been largely abandoned as impractical. The Americans, meanwhile, were producing proximity fuses at an astonishing rate. According to production records from the War Production Board, by December 1944, American factories were manufacturing over 800,000 proximity fuses per month. These were being loaded into 5-inch, 3-inch, and 40mm shells, creating a layered defense that could engage aircraft at virtually any altitude or distance. The transformation in American anti-aircraft capability was statistically overwhelming. Ship losses to kamikaze attacks, while still significant, were far lower than they would have been with conventional ammunition. October 25, 1944, marked the first organized kamikaze attacks during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and it was here that the terrifying effectiveness of American proximity-fused ammunition became undeniable to Japanese commanders. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who had conceived the kamikaze strategy out of desperate necessity, believed that suicide attacks would overwhelm American defenses through sheer determination and the difficulty of stopping a pilot willing to die. What he had not anticipated was that American ships would become nearly impenetrable fortresses. Ensign Yukio Seki, who led the first official kamikaze unit called Shimpu Special Attack Unit, approached the American escort carriers near Samar with 23 other pilots that morning. The Americans detected them at 20 miles distance. Radar, another technology where the United States had gained crushing superiority. By the time the Japanese aircraft closed to 10 miles, the American Combat Air Patrol had already shot down 7 planes. The remaining 16 pressed their attack, engines screaming as they dove toward the American ships. Then came the barrage that Japanese pilots had learned to dread. According to after-action reports from the escort carrier St. Lo, which would eventually be sunk by Seki's aircraft, the ship and her escorts fired over 2,000 5-inch shells in approximately 4 minutes. The proximity fuses transformed this ammunition into a 3-dimensional minefield. Shells exploded in tight patterns around each approaching aircraft, creating overlapping kill zones of high-velocity shrapnel. 12 more aircraft were destroyed before reaching their targets. Of the 4 that survived the gauntlet, 3 missed their targets completely, overwhelmed by the stress of flying through continuous explosions. Only Seki's aircraft struck home, penetrating the flight deck of St. Lo and detonating in the hangar bay, triggering secondary explosions that would sink the carrier. It was a tactical success born of extraordinary courage and skill, but the strategic mathematics were devastating for Japan. 23 aircraft and pilots, irreplaceable resources Japan could not afford to lose, had been expended to sink a single escort carrier, while the Americans had demonstrated they could destroy 90% of attackers before they reached their targets. Commander Rikihei Inaguchi, senior staff officer of the 1st Air Fleet and one of the architects of kamikaze tactics, analyzed the battle reports with growing desperation. The calculations were brutal and inescapable. If American defensive fire could destroy 9 of every 10 kamikaze aircraft, Japan would need to expend its entire remaining air force, thousands of planes and pilots, to inflict moderate damage on the American fleet. And even that assumed the Americans would not improve their defenses further, an assumption that daily combat reports proved foolishly optimistic. Captain Atsushi Oi, a staff officer who survived the war and later wrote extensively about Japanese naval operations, described the psychological impact on Japanese commanders in his post-war memoir. The proximity fuse, he wrote, created a sense of technological helplessness, unlike anything else in the war. Japanese officers understood they were outmatched in industrial production, in logistics, in resources, but those were quantitative disadvantages that courage and tactical brilliance might partially overcome. The proximity fuse represented something different, a qualitative leap that no amount of bravery could compensate for. By January 1945, Japanese intelligence services had made recovering an intact American proximity fuse their highest technical priority. Colonel Makoto Matsutani, head of the Imperial Army's Technical Intelligence Section, coordinated with Navy intelligence to offer extraordinary rewards for any unit that could retrieve an unexploded American shell. The problem, however, was the very security measure that made the weapon so effective: Proximity fuses were only used over water, where duds would sink beyond recovery. A breakthrough appeared to come in February 1945, when Japanese forces on Iwo Jima recovered fragments of American shells that had landed on the island's black sand beaches. These fragments, including partially intact electronic components, were immediately flown to Tokyo aboard one of the last transport aircraft to escape the island. Japanese engineers at the Army Technical Research Institute examined the components with growing amazement and dismay. According to post-war interviews preserved in the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey archives, the engineers were particularly stunned by the miniaturization and the apparent durability of the components. Dr. Hidetsugu Yagi, the Japanese physicist who had invented the Yagi antenna and was now directing military electronics research, examined the fragments personally. His report to Army headquarters, classified until 1952, concluded that the Americans had achieved a manufacturing precision in mass production that Japan could not match even in laboratory conditions. The vacuum tubes were smaller and more robust than anything Japanese industry could produce. More critically, the entire assembly required manufacturing tolerances of less than 1/100th of a millimeter, precision that Japanese factories, increasingly damaged by American bombing raids, could no longer achieve even if they had the designs. The tragic irony, documented in histories of wartime technology development, was that Japanese scientists possessed the theoretical knowledge to develop proximity fuses. Dr. Yagi himself had contributed fundamental research to radio wave propagation that underpinned the technology. But theoretical knowledge meant nothing without the industrial capacity to manufacture components in vast quantities, the quality control systems to ensure reliability, and the testing facilities to refine the design. Japan in 1945 possessed none of these advantages. Lieutenant General Torishiro Kawabe, Deputy Chief of the Imperial Army General Staff, received Dr. Yagi's report in early March. The conclusions were devastating. Japan could not replicate the proximity fuse before the war ended. Even if complete designs were somehow obtained, Japanese industry lacked the intact manufacturing infrastructure to produce the components. American bombing of Japanese cities, which had intensified dramatically after the fall of Saipan, provided bases for Boeing B-29 bombers, had destroyed much of Japan's precision manufacturing capacity. The Zaibatsu industrial conglomerates, Mitsubishi, Kawasaki, Nakajima, were all reporting severe production difficulties from damaged factories and disrupted supply chains. The psychological warfare value of the proximity fuse, though unintentional, was perhaps as important as its military effectiveness. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with American anti-aircraft fire, according to combat psychological evaluations conducted after the war, showed symptoms consistent with severe combat stress. They described feeling helpless, convinced that the Americans possessed weapons that could target individual aircraft with supernatural precision. This belief, while technically inaccurate, the fuses simply created better timed explosions, had the effect of undermining Japanese morale at precisely the moment when the military leadership was demanding suicidal devotion from its pilots. April 1st, 1945 witnessed the beginning of Operation Iceberg, the American invasion of Okinawa, and with it, the largest sustained kamikaze offensive of the war. Vice Admiral Motome Ugaki, now commanding all Japanese naval air forces from his headquarters on Kyushu, had assembled over 1,500 aircraft for what would be called the 10-go operations, 10 massive kamikaze attacks designed to destroy the American fleet off Okinawa. If the Americans could be driven away from Okinawa, Japanese strategists reasoned, perhaps negotiations for a less-than-total surrender might become possible. The first Kikusui attack, Floating Chrysanthemum, launched on April 6th with 355 kamikaze aircraft and 341 escort fighters. The Americans, having learned from previous battles, had positioned their radar picket destroyers in a ring around Okinawa at distances up to 75 miles from the main fleet. These destroyers, according to U.S. Navy action reports, were equipped with the latest Mark 12.2 radar systems and carried maximum loads of proximity-fused ammunition. They would serve as an early warning network and the first line of defense. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, commanding Destroyer Division 48 on picket duty, watched his radar screens fill with contacts as the Japanese aircraft approached. His ships opened fire at ranges exceeding 10 miles, their 5-inch guns hurling proximity-fused shells at trajectories calculated by mechanical computers. The sky between the picket ships and the approaching Japanese aircraft became a 3-dimensional battlefield of perfectly timed explosions. Lieutenant Junior Grade Yoshio Otaka, one of the few kamikaze pilots from this attack who survived, his aircraft was damaged but he successfully ditched, later described it as flying through a storm made of fire and metal. The statistics from the April 6th attack demonstrated both the effectiveness of American defenses and the terrible resolve of the kamikaze pilots. Of 355 kamikaze aircraft that launched, only 94 reached the main American fleet. American combat air patrols accounted for some losses, but naval gunfire, primarily proximity-fused ammunition, destroyed the majority. Of those 94 aircraft that penetrated to the main fleet, American ships shot down 63 more. 31 aircraft actually struck American ships, sinking 3 destroyers and 2 ammunition ships while damaging 10 other vessels. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the 5th Fleet from his flagship Indianapolis, reviewed these casualty reports with grim satisfaction. While the losses were painful, hundreds of American sailors had died. The exchange ratio was clearly unsustainable for Japan. The Japanese had expended 355 aircraft and irreplaceable pilots to sink 5 ships and damage 10 others. The American fleet numbered over 1,300 vessels. At this rate, Japan would exhaust its entire remaining air force before inflicting decisive damage. Captain Toshikazu Omae, a staff officer at Combined Fleet Headquarters who coordinated kamikaze operations, reached the same conclusion from the opposite perspective. His confidential report to Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the Combined Fleet, dated April 10, 1945, bluntly assessed the situation. American defensive capabilities, particularly their anti-aircraft fire, had rendered kamikaze attacks militarily ineffective despite the extraordinary courage of the pilots. The report, preserved in Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies archives, recommended that further kamikaze operations be suspended until new tactics could be developed. Admiral Toyoda rejected Captain Omae's recommendation to suspend kamikaze operations, not because he disagreed with the analysis, but because Japan had no alternative strategies left. The Imperial Navy had been effectively destroyed as a conventional fighting force at Leyte Gulf. The Army Air Force was husbanding its remaining aircraft for the expected invasion of the home islands. Kamikaze attacks, however costly and ineffective, represented the only way Japan could continue to inflict casualties on the American fleet. And inflicting casualties remained Japan's sole strategic hope. If American casualties mounted high enough, perhaps the United States might negotiate rather than insist on unconditional surrender. The 9th Kikusui attack, launched on June 7, 1945 with 29 aircraft, illustrated how desperate Japanese tactics had become. Rather than mass attacks that American radar could detect at long range, Japanese planners now sent small groups flying at extremely low altitude, hoping to evade radar detection and slip through American defenses. It was a tactic born of weakness. Small groups had less chance of saturating defenses, but it was all that remained feasible given Japan's dwindling aircraft reserves. Ensign Teruo Yamaguchi, piloting a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, approached the American radar picket line just after dawn on June 7th. Flying barely 10 feet above the ocean surface, Yamaguchi hoped his aircraft would be lost in the sea clutter on American radar screens. But the U.S. Navy's radar technology had improved throughout the war. The radar operator aboard the destroyer William D. Porter detected Yamaguchi's aircraft at 12 miles distance. The ship's 5-inch guns opened fire at 8 miles, and the proximity-fused shells began their deadly work. The first shell exploded 50 feet above and ahead of Yamaguchi's aircraft. The second detonated 30 feet to his left. Yamaguchi, his hands gripping the control stick so hard his knuckles turned white, threw his aircraft into violent evasive maneuvers. But proximity fuses cared nothing for evasive action. The shells were not trying to hit him. They were creating overlapping zones of shrapnel that made the air itself lethal. The third shell exploded directly above his canopy. Shrapnel tore through the thin aluminum skin of the Judy, shredding control cables and puncturing fuel tanks. Yamaguchi's aircraft, trailing smoke and flames, plunged into the Pacific. He was 19 years old. Commander Tadashi Nakajima, one of the few Japanese officers who both participated in kamikaze operations and survived the war, later wrote in his memoir that by June 1945, Japanese pilots understood that launching on a kamikaze mission meant mathematical near certainty of death without accomplishing the mission. Previous Japanese military doctrine had celebrated warriors who fought knowing they would die, but those warriors had at least possessed a reasonable chance of taking enemies with them. The proximity fuse had changed this calculus. Now pilots died in flames and their targets sailed on untouched, protected by a defensive technology that seemed like magic. The psychological impact on Japanese military leadership was profound. Admiral Ugaki's diary entries from May and June 1945, published posthumously, reveal a man wrestling with the implications of technological inferiority. Ugaki had been a battleship admiral, trained to think in terms of armor thickness, gun caliber, and torpedo ranges, tangible factors that could be measured and compared. The proximity fuse represented something more insidious, a technological sophistication that suggested American society itself operated at a higher level of organization and capability than Japan could match. August 6, 1945, brought a different kind of instant destruction when the atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima, followed by Nagasaki on August 9th. But by then, Japanese military commanders had already internalized a crucial lesson. The American military possessed technological capabilities Japan could not match, understand, or counter. The proximity fuse, while far less famous than the atomic bomb, had delivered this lesson thousands of times during the war's final year. Every kamikaze pilot who died in a ball of fire before reaching his target, every bomber formation decimated by perfectly timed shell bursts, every tactical plan that failed because American defensive fire proved impenetrable, all reinforced the same terrible truth. Admiral Ugaki, who refused to accept surrender and flew on a final kamikaze mission on August 15th, embodied the tragic futility of courage against overwhelming technological superiority. His aircraft, along with 10 others carrying volunteer crews, attempted to attack American ships off Okinawa. American radar detected them at long range. Combat air patrol fighters intercepted them. Those few aircraft that survived the fighters encountered the proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire that had killed thousands of their comrades. None reached their targets. Ugaki and his men simply vanished into the Pacific, their deaths accomplishing nothing except adding to the war's vast casualty lists. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that proximity-fused ammunition had been one of the war's decisive technologies. According to the survey's statistical analysis, proximity fuses improved anti-aircraft effectiveness by approximately 500% compared to time-fused shells. During the Okinawa campaign alone, American ships had fired over 1 million proximity-fused shells. The mathematical result was clear. Without proximity fuses, American casualties from kamikaze attacks would have been several times higher, possibly high enough to influence strategic decision-making about the invasion of Japan. For the Japanese officers who survived the war, the proximity fuse became a symbol of the technological and industrial gap that had doomed their nation's imperial ambitions. Captain Atsushi Oi, in his post-war writings, argued that Japan's leaders had fundamentally misunderstood modern warfare. They had believed spirit and determination could compensate for material disadvantages, that Bushido principles and warrior training could overcome industrial production. The proximity fuse demonstrated the fatal flaw in this thinking. No amount of courage could defeat an enemy who could make the air itself explode with perfect timing. The technology's legacy extended far beyond World War II. Proximity fuses revolutionized not just anti-aircraft warfare, but artillery generally. During the Korean War, artillery shells equipped with proximity fuses proved devastatingly effective against infantry and light vehicles. The principle, using miniaturized electronics to improve weapon effectiveness, became a cornerstone of modern military technology development. Today's smart weapons, guided missiles, and precision munitions all descend conceptually from those first proximity-fused shells fired in the Pacific. Yet perhaps the most important legacy was psychological and strategic. The proximity fuse demonstrated that advanced technology, properly deployed, could create tactical advantages so overwhelming that they became strategically decisive. Japanese military commanders in 1944 and 1945 could not comprehend how American ships could fire thousands of shells that seemed to detonate with perfect precision, because they could not conceive of the manufacturing sophistication, quality control systems, and research infrastructure that made such weapons possible. That failure of imagination, the inability to understand the depths of American technological and industrial capability, contributed directly to Japan's catastrophic strategic miscalculations. The shells that exploded in perfect timing above the Pacific, creating walls of shrapnel that no courage could penetrate, represented more than just a clever engineering solution to anti-aircraft defense. They represented the triumph of systematic scientific research, industrial organization, and manufacturing excellence, capabilities that would define military power for generations to come. The Japanese could not comprehend how the Americans fired thousands of shells in an instant because they were not merely observing a weapon, but witnessing the application of an entirely different approach to warfare itself, one where technology and industry had become as decisive as courage and tactics. In that thunderous Pacific sky, the future of modern warfare had announced itself, and nothing would ever be the same.